Hey guys, it's Christa Watson here from Christa Quilts, and I'm excited to welcome you to another fun chat. I'm really hoping you're enjoying my weekly YouTube videos, and just a reminder, you can see everything that I have over at Christa Quilts on YouTube, and a really easy way to find it is just Google christaquilts.tv and you'll find me. So first of all, I just really want to thank you guys for all of the love. I've only been doing these videos for a couple weeks now, and the response has been wonderful. The plan right now is that I alternate every other week, first of all with an informal chat like we're doing today, and then I intersperse that with some really good in-depth video tutorials. So whether you are a brand new beginner or a seasoned expert, join me every single week so that I can help you enjoy everything there is to do with quilting. Because you know what? Part of the fun of quilting is not only making the quilts, it's also making quilty friends. So my hope is that you'll watch these or maybe even listen to them while you sew. It's kind of like you and I are hanging out together in your sewing room. So I'll give you a quick little update about what's been happening in my world this week, and then we'll get into the meat of our topic, which is a trunk show from the quilts from my very first book, Machine Quilting with Style. So this past week, I attended a really fun trade show here in Las Vegas called VDTA and SDTA. That stands for the Vacuum Dealers Trade Association and Sewing Dealers Trade Association. It's basically a wholesale show for quilt shops and also vacuum dealers who sell these machines. And it's a chance for quilt shops to see the latest and greatest. Well, as many of you know, I debuted my Christa cabinet there, and it was a hit. I've been working with Arrow for the last 2 years, and in one of my previous episodes, I go a little bit more in depth all about my cabinet. It's coming out soon, and you can get your hands on it, and I'll have a more in-depth video later on as well. But for now, if you're interested, you can check out the links in the comments to find out more information about that. I've also been doing some secret sewing behind the scenes on my brand new fabric collection, which will come out later in the year, and I'm putting the finishing touches on my brand new book. So lots to come later on, and even if you're watching this, months in the future, year in the future, you can go back and you can kind of see what it was like behind the scenes. So you can find everything that I share over on my website at christaquilts.com, and you can visit my shop at shop.christaquilts.com. So what are we talking about this week? I am excited to tell you a little bit of the behind the scenes story with how my very first book came to be. Machine Quilting with Style, published with Martingale, came out in 2015. So like everything I do, there's a little bit of a backstory. I've been sewing for over 25 years, and from the moment I picked up needle and thread, I knew that I wanted quilting to be my job. I always say, there's no such thing as overnight success, and it took me a while to figure out what I wanted to do. So back then when I began quilting, I had young children, and I wasn't really able to travel. However, I knew that there were these amazing teachers that would go and they'd travel all over the country, they'd write books, they'd share patterns, and I knew that's what I wanted to do. However, I knew that the timing wasn't quite right yet, and I just kind of stuck to my local area, teaching what I knew, which was basically how to make a quilt from start to finish. I had a great time doing it locally, and I joined my local guild. Now, whenever these celebrities, these traveling teachers would come to my guild, I loved listening to them. I loved hearing their presentations. I thought they were so interesting, and I took their classes whenever I could. And I saw them write their books and share their quilts, and I was so inspired, and I thought, someday that will be me, but the timing just wasn't quite right yet. So I just continued teaching in my local area, honing my skills and having a great time doing it. So fast forward to 2013, which was a magical year for me that changed my quilty life. I attended Quilt Con, which was the very first time it was held and put on by the Modern Quilt Guild. Even though it was all about modern quilting, there were some business elements to the show. I was able to attend some lectures and hear presentations about those who were doing what I wanted to do. They were teaching, writing books, patterns, and it kind of opened my eyes to what was possible. It was also the time where I made a lot of wonderful industry connections. I met Jackie Gearing, I became friends with Angela Walters, I met a lot of movers and shakers in the quilting industry. And one of those very important and influential people in my life was I met Mary Fons for the very first time. At the time, she was an editor for one of the modern quilting magazines that were on the scene, and this is kind of where life comes full circle. Her mom, Mary Ann Fons, wrote the book, along with Liz Porter, The Quilter's Complete Guide to Quilting. That was the very first book I ever purchased and learned a lot of quilting. So then all these years later, the very first time I was ever published in a magazine was with her daughter, Mary Fons. And the way that came about was that I had contacted her at the show, told her I was interested in writing some for her magazine, and she told me to submit something. So when I got home from the show, I submitted. She really liked it, and not only did she like what I had submitted, my Charming Chevrons quilt, it actually made the cover of the magazine. Now that magazine is no longer around, and I have remade that quilt and re-released it on my own. But that very first time getting published gave me the confidence that perhaps if she liked my work, others would as well. So once I got home from Quilt Con, I started researching what it would take to write a book. I read everything I could, I listened, I interviewed people, I talked to people that were authors, some friends of mine, and that all led me to publishing my book with Martingale. Now the reason I chose them is because they really seemed like a good fit with my personality, and I had some friends that had some very good experiences with them. So my idea for the book that I pitched to them was basically how to make a modern quilt. Now that's not at all what the book is about, but that was kind of what I had in my mind. They really liked the idea, but they said, you know what, we're not really into the modern audience. Could you expand it and make it a little bit more broad? I said, sure, that's no problem, because really what the book was about is how to make a quilt from start to finish, no matter if it's modern, traditional art, or what the style was. So it took me probably about 6 months to write the whole book, about another 5 or 6 months to make the projects, and then it takes a whole year from the time you turn in a manuscript for it to actually go through the editing process, get printed, and get published. So my idea was in 2013, but the book didn't actually come out until 2015. But you know what? I didn't mind the whole process at all. In fact, I was thrilled. And I'll tell you a secret. When I wrote a book, I had very, very few goals. I wanted to write a book, I wanted my name on it, and I wanted it to have quilts inside. So I was pretty easygoing when it came to changes they wanted to make to the book, and just working with them was such a dream. In fact, I had such a good experience working with them that now, since 2015, I've actually written a total of 4 books with Martingale. But the one I'm going to focus on today is the quilts from Machine Quilting with Style. So recently the publisher let me know that Machine Quilting with Style has gone out of print, and I was able to secure the last remaining copies. So if you would like to get one and be a part of my history, make sure you head over to my website and I'll be happy to sign a copy for you. And so now I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of the quilts from Machine Quilting with Style. I hope you enjoy them. So now I'm excited to show you this virtual quilt show of the quilts from Machine Quilting with Style. It's 12 projects, and it's really like 2 books in one. I show you all these really fun modern quilts and how to make the top, and I give you machine quilting ideas so you can finish them. So the first one is called Ripples, and it's basically my version of a modern log cabin. I really learned to fall in love with what I call a coordinated, scrappy look. In other words, why use one teal fabric when 20 will do? You still have that really good contrast that's in a traditional log cabin block of light and dark. But I use lots of blues and greens and teals for the darks, and some really pretty shimmery grays and low volume light colors for the light fabrics. In this quilt for machine quilting, I explored the idea of using decorative stitches with your walking foot instead of just stitching in the ditch or quilting straight lines. And you'll see how I have continued and expanded on this idea in some of my current work now. This next quilt is called Rain, and it's probably my most modern quilt that I've designed. In fact, I was really proud that I was able to show this several years ago when it hung in Quilt Con. Now, the fun story about this quilt is that my husband Jason actually designed this on his iPad one day when we were kind of joking, and he said, oh, I could design a modern quilt. And you know what? I loved his sketch that I took it and I turned it into this quilt. For the machine quilting, I really had a good time emphasizing those rain streaks with the quilting by using different colored threads. Now the way that I quilted it is first I anchor quilted with some of the lines in the ditches to hold it together, and I did that in the cream fabric. Then I went through and I quilted all of the red streaks and all of the blue streaks. Now the reason you can see those lines of quilting extending all the way across the quilt, that's out of pure laziness and a little bit of a design element. Rather than having to start and stop each individual line of quilting, if I could stitch all the way across the quilt with one start and stop, I knew it would be a lot easier to accomplish. This next quilt is called Color Crystals, and I call it my modern jelly roll quilt. It was a personal challenge to myself when I heard that a lot of people would say, oh, you can't really make modern quilts out of jelly rolls. And I said, you know what? I beg to differ. This was actually inspired by the pieced backing of my original chevrons quilt that was in Mary Fonz's magazine that I spoke about earlier. So check out the original back of the chevrons quilt, and you can see how I took that element and I played around with it to come up with a new design for color crystals. Many times I'll have one seed of an idea and it'll go off in lots of different directions. I also learned in this book that black on black does not show up very well. So this was probably the last time I quilted black thread on black fabric. The other fun thing about this quilt is that there were lots of leftovers from the jelly roll strip, so I just used those on a back to create a secondary composition. Whether you like the front or the back, it's like a double-sided quilt. This quilt here is called Little Man's Fancy, done in some really pretty blues, maybe perhaps for little baby boy. I got the idea of this quilt by taking one block called the Gentleman's Fancy and blowing it up and supersizing it, because that's kind of a fun element to play around with in modern quilts. This was also the first iteration of my design that I called Shattered Lines, which you see shows up later on in some of my work as well. This quilt is called Static, and it's kind of my own tongue-in-cheek joke to myself. At the time I was writing this book, pixelated quilts are all the rage, and they're still very popular now. That's the idea that you take an image and you pixelate it so it looks a little fuzzy, or like it could have, if you zoom in on it, it forms a design. Well, my joke is, do you see something in the static? Because this doesn't form a design at all, it's just those fun pixelated squares. But you know what? It's still a fun quilt to make. It's super easy and super simple. The hardest part about this quilt, in fact, was not over quilting it to death like I like to do. The very simple minimalist quilting will have you finishing this one in no time, and it's really fun for scraps. This quilt is called Square in a Square, and now the traditional square in the square block looks like something completely different, but as I designed this quilt, I realized it was a square inside of a larger square, inside of an entire large square. And I really had fun with this quilt, combining both walking foot quilting in the blocks and free motion quilting in the background. So this is what I would call custom modern quilting, where you would stitch one design with the walking foot and one design with free motion. I love to do all the walking foot quilting first, and then I'll add the free motion, and it all comes together very nicely. This next quilt is called Focal Point, and it's kind of my homage to the modern quilting movement that says if you have a focal point on your quilt where you can draw your eye in, that's going to make it much more interesting rather than repeating the same pattern over and over again. So with this one, I played around with the idea of cropped offset designs that maybe perhaps if you made 4 of these, you could create a larger design and it would look completely different. This one also hung in Quilt Con a few years ago, and I was very pleased with the reception that it got. I also explored quilting the continuous spiral, which is one of my absolute favorite walking foot designs, and you'll see that come up in my work. The basic idea with the spiral is you decide where you're going to start, you draw the beginning of the spiral, and then you continue quilting round and round and round with your walking foot until the design is done. And depending on how wide your foot is, that's how widely spaced your lines are going to be. With this quilt Lightning, I really have a thing for black and white. These quilts, of course, were all made before I designed fabric, but I love black and white and a bright pop of color. This design is another one in my exploration of what I call structured improv. If you look very closely, it's basically just a rail fence design, which is a traditional design idea, but I'm taking it and I've made these wonky logs that are a little bit offset, and each block is completely different. That shock of color, that streak of lightning that runs through it, gives you that focal point and adds a lot of interest to the quilt. I so desperately wanted to include how to make a piece back in this book, but there wasn't enough room in the book, so that part got cut out. However, there's a download, and I'll put the link in the comments below, so just make sure you check out the information box below to grab that. Next we have Candy Pop. Now for the machine quilting, it's what I call an edge-to-edge continuous design that's semi-custom. What I mean by that is you can quilt from one edge to the other without breaking thread. Whenever you get to a block, you just change your quilting design and you keep on going. And in order to make that successful, you'd use one thread for the entire quilt and you create this wonderful texture. I also created a pieced backing for Candy Pop using some of the leftover blocks and fabrics. Again, I love pieced backings as much as I love the front of the quilt sometimes. This quilt called Broken V is made from lots and lots of half square triangles and exploring what different types of designs can be made just by rotating a few blocks. In this quilt, I also learned what a difference it can make depending on which type of quilting design you use. There's basically two motifs, pebbles and another fun design called triangle texture. They're both very dense. However, the pebble quilting took twice as long to quilt the same amount of space because it's a much more dense, compact design. Okay, this quilt is facets, and I know you're not supposed to have a favorite. It's like picking a favorite child, but this one is my favorite. It was actually the first design I came up with in the book, and it really pushed me to go a little bit more modern. I love this idea of crazy piecing where you make your own fabric with lots of bits of leftovers, but then cutting them into recognizable shapes. This is also hung in several quilt shows, and I do want to give a shout out and say it did get a ribbon at Paducah. And the reason I want to bring that up is because this quilt is far from perfect, but because it really has that high contrast and it makes an impact, it wowed the judges and they enjoyed it too. But you know what? I enter shows to show my work, and every now and then other people like them as well. The last quilt in the book is called Pearl Gray, and it's actually the first incarnation of a design that now stands on its own as its own pattern. This was also the first iteration of my geometric chains design. You can look closely and you can see this design called String of Pearls, which is basically a line in a circle. When I remade the new quilt in my own fabric and changed it to fit the charm packs, I explored that idea further with coming up with lots of different chain motifs, all using different geometrics. In fact, I love this design so much, it may just make an appearance in a future fabric, so stay tuned. I sure hope you enjoyed looking at all these quilts. It was a real fun walk down memory lane, and again, I had such a wonderful experience writing this book, making the quilts, and you know what? Even though this book is a few years old, we still use the quilts. We love them to this day, and if this is your beginning journey into quilting, I'm here to help you every step of the way. So make sure you pop over to shop.christaquilts.com to get your signed copy of Machine Quilting with Style. I'm here to be your cheerleader and hope you have a happy quilting day.